Hello there. This is going to be an 8-part presentation about the story of early Christianity and the early church. This part 1 will have an introduction about why the early church and its history is important. I'll share a little bit about myself, some of the sources I'll be using. We'll talk a little bit about calendars and how they were used in the Roman period, what happened to the apostles, and this will be a list of about 25 people, so it's more than just the 12 apostles. Talk a little bit about Roman emperors during the New Testament period, the importance of Judaism to the early church, the eventual decline of the Jewish church, and the persecution of the church, conflicts first with Judaism and then with Rome. First of all, a little introduction on why the story of early Christians is important in early Christianity. First of all, as believers today, anyone who is a Christian, their story, these early Christians, these first believers, is our story as well. All followers of Jesus are examples of faith to us. Hebrews 12:1 talks about the great cloud of witnesses, all believers who have come before us. Of course, the early believers were imperfect, just like we are. They had weaknesses and flaws, and they were imperfect. But I also believe God has always providentially directed and protected his church. This doesn't mean that God is controlling every event in history, but he is taking steps to make sure his church continues on. Some of the most important doctrines that nearly all Christians believe were articulated in the first few centuries of early Christianity. These include the doctrine of the Trinity, that there's one God, three persons, and the doctrine of the divinity and humanity of Jesus, that Jesus is both fully God and fully human. I think it's important to learn about the early Christians because many of us don't know much about them. So it's worthwhile to learn about them and their story. A little bit about myself. My name is Kevin Jackson. I've been married a little bit over 30 years. There's a picture of my wife there as well. That was for our 30th anniversary. It's in Gibraltar. We have 3 grown children. I come from a Protestant background, Nazarene church. And so this presentation will be coming from a Protestant viewpoint. I will try to make notes about when there are things that Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox may disagree with Protestants about, and this presentation is not to be critical or hostile of those other Christian histories, but just be aware this is coming from a Protestant viewpoint. I'm not a trained theologian. I am a IT guy, and so I don't pretend to be a trained theologian. I've been learning as I go along to teach this history. I'm currently teaching a Sunday school class in our church about the early church history, and so this presentation is a result of having taught that Sunday school class. The resources I'll primarily be using for this presentation are these 2 books. I highly recommend both of them. The first is The Story of Christian Theology by Roger Olson. He is a retired Baptist professor from Baylor University. And the second resource is The Story of Christianity from 1985 by Justo Gonzalez. And he is a retired Methodist professor from Columbia Theological Seminary. I'll also be using these pictures and things I find on the internet, so not everything is from these 2 books. Some sources are from the internet. I want to mention a little bit about the calendars used by the early church. The first is the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar had 365.25 days a year. It was named after Julius Caesar. It was first implemented in 46 BC. And in the Julian calendar, counting was based off the reign of an emperor. So whenever there was a new emperor, they'd start the calendar over at year 1. And so the Julian calendar has no zeros. It's year 1 of the new emperor and goes on from there. And in the New Testament, you can see an example of Luke using the Julian calendar when he says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. The second calendar I want to mention is called the Anno Mundi calendar, which means the year of the world. calendar. It was a Hebrew Jewish calendar. My understanding is Judaism today still uses this calendar. It's, in fact, one of the two official calendars of the state of Israel. In the Anno Mundi calendar, uh, it's based off of a literal interpretation of Genesis, where you add up the age of all the folks mentioned in there, and you come up to, with right now, it would be 5784. And when I'm making this presentation, it is 2025. So the Anno Mundi calendar was based on a 354 days per year, a lunar calendar. And then, since that's short of what an actual year is, about every third year they would add in a 30-day leap month. So every third year would be a bit longer with the Anno Mundi calendar. This calendar may be what Jesus and the disciples used. They definitely would have been aware of it. They would have been aware of the Julian calendar as well. And this calendar was also used by some early Christians, especially more Jewish type Christians. The calendar we use today is called the Anno Domini calendar, which means the year of our Lord. It was created by a monk named Dionysius in the year 525 AD. An anglicized version of his name would be Dennis. So Dionysius was a Scythian monk who lived in the area of modern Romania. So Scythia is basically that area in yellow and red there. Some of it right where the war is going on right now between in Ukraine and Russia. And he was a monk in that little red dot in Romania. And then later on, he moved to Rome. And at that time, the church mostly used the Julian calendar, but it was based on the Easter schedule they created was based on the reign of Diocletian, who was a Roman emperor who was very severe to Christians and persecuted them. So Dionysius wanted to honor Christ instead when he was coming up with the new Easter schedule, and so he came up with this AD calendar. Now, he was off a few years about when Jesus was born. Most people don't think Jesus was born year zero. They think maybe 4 or 5 BC was when he was born. And this calendar gradually caught on over time. Not necessarily everybody in Christendom adopted it right away, but eventually most people used it. And then the last calendar we'll mention is the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use today. It has 365.24 days a year instead of the 365.25 of the Julian calendar. So what had happened is the Julian calendar is just a bit too long, so over a period of years, the calendar had gotten ahead of where it actually should be. So Pope Gregory the 13th in the year 1582 introduces the Gregorian calendar in Catholic parts of Europe. So in Spain, France, Italy, those areas, it was adopted right away. And it advanced the calendar by 10 days from the Julian calendar. So if you're around in October of 1582, you would have had 10 days cut out from your month. So John Wesley, his birthday, so it was adopted in England in the year 1752, which by then the calendar was 11 days ahead. So, for example, John Wesley's birthday would have changed from June 17th to June 28th. And the calendar is pretty much used around the world these days. Some Orthodox churches still use the Julian calendar for their holidays, so that's why Orthodox groups celebrate Christmas, for example, at a later date than most Christians. Okay, now we're going to talk about what happened to the apostles. And as I mentioned in the introduction, this is not just the 12 disciples. This is a little bit wider list of about 25 people. In some cases, the Bible tells us what happened to them. For example, James, it says, was killed by King Herod. In other cases, there are early Christian sources and traditions that give insight to what happened. And I think these are probably true. For other apostles, we don't know, and there are later speculative traditions that developed. Those traditions might be true or they might be inaccurate. We just don't know. And the reason why is because in later centuries, certain cities would claim that an apostle had visited there. Maybe they have the apostles' relics there, and it becomes a bit of a tourist attraction. So I think these later speculative ideas about where the apostles went might not be accurate, but they could be. We just don't know. So what happened to the apostles? First, we'll talk about James, the son of Zebedee. He was the brother of John, the apostle John. Jesus called James and John the sons of thunder. In the Bible, he's sometimes called James the Greater, and this doesn't mean he was more important, but it's most likely due to his size. He's probably a large person. If you've watched the series The Chosen about Jesus, he calls his disciples Big James and Little James, and that's probably what was going on there, why James the son of Zebedee is called James the Greater. He is the first apostle to be a martyr. He's killed by King Herod. That's recorded in Acts 12:2 in about the year 44. James, the brother of Jesus. So this James was not a disciple. He's not one of Jesus' disciples. He was a brother of Jesus, at least according to Protestant tradition. According to Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, he would have been a cousin to Jesus, not his a cousin to Jesus, not his actual brother. It's recorded that he became a believer after the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. He's sometimes called James the Just. He's the author of the book of James. He was a Christian leader in Jerusalem, and he was martyred in about 62 AD in Jerusalem by the order of the high priest Ananias. And then the third James to mention is James the son of Alphaeus, sometimes called James the Lesser or James the Younger. He's not mentioned a lot in the New Testament, but tradition says he went east, possibly to Syria or Persia. And then, of course, the Apostle Paul, who is quite famous. Since most of us know quite a bit about the Apostle Paul, I don't mention too much about him here. But he was the missionaries to the Gentiles. He wrote much of the New Testament. A lot of the letters in the New Testament are written by Paul, possibly the book of Hebrews as well. It's recorded in Acts that he appealed to Caesar when he was in Israel and then was sent to Rome, and then he was acquitted in 62 AD. Caesar at this time would have been Nero, and initially Paul is acquitted by Nero, but there comes a time of persecution later in Rome after the Great Fire, and it's believed that Paul was martyred during the persecution of Nero. And you'll notice in this picture, you'll see a sword off to the right side of Paul, his left side, our right side. And in a lot of these older pictures, this is a picture by an Italian artist around the year 1600, I think. It'll show the weapon that it's believed they were killed by. So Paul, being a citizen of Rome, was not crucified. He was beheaded, which was a better way to die than to be crucified. Then we got Simon Peter. He was one of Jesus' closest disciples. He wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. Church Father Irenaeus writes that Peter helped to found the church in Rome, and tradition says he was martyred in either Beirut or Rome at about the time of Nero's persecutions. Then we have Simon the Zealot. He was one of the 12 disciples. The Zealots were Jews who advocated violence to overthrow the Romans. Simon the Zealot is not mentioned a lot in the New Testament. Some traditions say he went to Persia, and you see that Simon is holding a saw there because some traditions say that he was sawed in half when he was martyred. Then John Mark. John Mark was a traveling companion for a while with Paul and Barnabas. That's recorded in Acts chapter 12. He was a cousin of Barnabas from Cyprus. He wrote the book of Mark, likely the first written the 4 Gospels that were written down. Possibly had information from Peter. It may be that Peter provided or dictated some of the information that Mark wrote down. And tradition says that Mark was martyred in Alexandria, Egypt, about the year 68 AD, possibly by being dragged through the streets. We've got Barnabas. He was the cousin of John Mark, who we just mentioned. He was a Levite from Cyprus. and a traveling missionary for a while with Paul. And tradition says Barnabas was martyred in Cyprus. And I'll make a note about the name Barnabas here while we're at it. So in Aramaic, the word bar means son. So, like my last name is Jackson. In Aramaic, bar means son. So that'd be son of Nabas, or not sure how you'd say that exactly. But anyway, a lot of the apostles and disciples and people had bar at the front of their name because of that. It's a bit of a family name. Then we've got Silas, who was a traveling missionary with Paul. Silas, like Paul, was also from Tarsus. He was a Hellenistic, that is to say, a Greek Jew. And Silas is believed to have been martyred about the same time as Paul, possibly in Rome, about 65 AD. And then we've got Bartholomew, also sometimes called Nathaniel. He was one of the 12 disciples. According to church historian Eusebius and Jerome, Bartholomew went to Armenia and then possibly to India. And tradition says that Bartholomew was skinned, and you can see in the picture there he's holding a fillet knife. And then Jude. Jude is also a brother of Jesus and wrote the book of Jude. Again, if you're from a Roman Catholic background, you'd believe that Jude was a relative of Jesus, not his actual brother. And then Jude, tradition says that he went to Armenia, possibly with Bartholomew, and he may have been martyred in Beirut, modern-day Lebanon, in about 65 AD. Then Philip. Philip is one of the 12 disciples. He came from Bethsaida. That's a town close to the Sea of Galilee, the same town where Peter and Andrew were from. In John chapter 6, Jesus asked Philip how they can feed the 5,000. So the story of the 5,000 men would have actually been probably 10 to 15,000 total people. Is believed to take place close to Bethsaida, which is why Jesus would have asked Philip this particular question, because Philip would have been familiar with the area. Philip is a Greek name, and it's believed he preached in Greece, Syria, and Asia Minor, which would be modern-day Turkey. And then he is martyred in Turkey between the years 54 and 80 AD. Next up is Philip the Evangelist. This is a different Philip. He's first mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 6. He's one of the 7 chosen to help out the poor in Jerusalem. Philip is one of the first people to preach to non-Jews. That's recorded that he preached in Samaria to the Samaritans in Acts chapter 8. He's famous for baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. He also preached to Simon the magician. And he's last mentioned in Acts 21 of the New Testament that he settled in Caesarea with his 4 daughters who prophesied. Tradition says that Philip was also crucified, and maybe that some sources mix up the 2 Philips that we talked about here. Next up is Andrew. Andrew was first a follower of John the Baptist, and then he became a disciple of Jesus. He's the first disciple who Jesus called. That's recorded in John chapter 1. He's the younger brother of Turkey. Andrew went to Greece, Turkey, and possibly Crimea in the area of the Black Sea. And tradition says that Andrew was crucified in Patras, Greece, about the year 60 AD. Next up is Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples, famous for being doubting Thomas after the resurrection. He said he wouldn't believe in Jesus unless he could touch him and feel his side. And tradition says that Thomas went to Persia and India, and there's pretty good evidence that he did go to India. And tradition says that Thomas was killed by a soldier while he was in India. Next up is Matthew, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. He wrote the book of Matthew. There are varying traditions. Some say he went to Persia or possibly Ethiopia, and some traditions say he was killed by the king of Ethiopia when he was there. Then Matthias. Matthias is the disciple who replaced Judas after Judas killed himself. That is recorded in Acts chapter 1. And he's not mentioned again in the New Testament after the one time in Acts. And there are conflicting traditions about where Matthias traveled. He possibly went to Syria or Greece. And you can see he is holding an axe there. And then Thaddeus, sometimes also called Jude or Judas, the son of James. This is not Judas Iscariot, different Judas. Thaddeus is a family nickname, and it means heart. Some traditions say Thaddeus went north and started a church in Edessa, Turkey, or modern-day Turkey, and that would be that little red dot on the map is where Edessa was located. Then the Apostle Luke, he wrote the books of Luke and Acts. Some people think he may have written Hebrews as well. He's famous for traveling with Paul and recording Paul's missionary journeys. Luke was a doctor. He's likely a Gentile. And according to tradition, Luke was killed in Greece at the age of 84. Next up, the Apostle John, also one of the 12 disciples. He wrote the Gospel of John, the three letters of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. He's the only apostle that, according to Scripture, was not martyred, although there are some reports that he may have been boiled in oil at some point and survived it. And John is exiled to Patmos in sometime in the 90s, and that's recorded in Revelation. And if you look at the map there, Patmos is about in the area of that little red circle, a very small island. And then Apollos. Apollos, it was a Jew of Greek background from Alexandria, Egypt. Many Jews left Alexandria in about the year 38 due to a severe pogrom, so it may have been that Apollos left Alexandria at that time. Acts records that he was taught by Priscilla and Aquila. They gave him a more full picture of the gospel. Apollos was an eloquent speaker, and he taught in both Corinth and Ephesus. He's mentioned 3 times, or he's mentioned in Acts, and then 3 times in Paul's letters. And Church Father Jerome wrote that when Apollos left Corinth, he went on to Crete and then back to Corinth. And some people also propose that Apollos could have been the author of Hebrews. That was what Martin Luther believed. And then the last 2 we'll mention are Priscilla and Aquila. They were a married couple who worked with Paul. They initially lived in Rome, and then the Roman emperor kicked all the Jews out of Rome. At that time, they moved to Corinth. They are mentioned 6 times in the New Testament, 3 times in the book of Acts, and 3 times in Paul's letters. In 4 of the 6 times that they are mentioned, Priscilla is mentioned first, which was unusual convention for the time. So it may have been that Priscilla was the more active or outgoing leader of the 2 of them. They were tent makers, like the Apostle Paul, and tradition says that Priscilla and Aquila were martyred together. Now I want to talk a little bit about important Roman emperors during the period of the New Testament. First is Octavius Augustus, or Caesar Augustus. He's mentioned in Luke chapter 1. He was the Caesar when Jesus was born. Augustus is a title, so his real name would have been Octavius. Augustus means essentially your highness or something to that effect. The next one mentioned in the Bible is Tiberius. He was emperor from 14 to 37 AD. Luke mentions that he was emperor when John the Baptist began preaching. The third we'll mention here is Emperor Claudius. As I mentioned a little bit ago, he issued an edict, which was recorded in Acts 18:2, to force all the Jews to leave Rome, and that would have included Priscilla and Aquila. And Roman historian Tacitus, who was not a Christian, says that Claudius issued this edict because Jews were fighting about somebody named Christos. So it's believed that they were arguing about Christianity and who the person of Jesus was, and Claudius had enough of it and issued an edict to force all the Jews to leave Rome. Next up is Nero. First thing I'll mention is that Nero invites the Jews to come back to Rome. Apparently, it was bad for business to kick them all out. It's recorded that Nero was a Roman sources. So Tacitus, for example, says that Nero was tyrannical, self-indulgent, and was a pleasure seeker. When Paul appeals in Acts chapter 25, he's appealing to go visit Nero, and then it's believed that Paul was acquitted after appealing to Nero. But then later on, Nero becomes hostile to Christianity and eventually has Paul executed. Philippians 4:22, Paul mentions those of Caesar's household who he greets, and that would have been Nero. And then after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Nero begins to persecute the Christians. He was looking for a scapegoat to blame, and when Rome was burnt down, some of the areas that didn't burn down had more Christians, and so it was convenient for him to blame the Christians. And Nero eventually commits suicide. There were people coming to get him, and so that was his choice, is to commit suicide. That was his way of ending his reign. And then there are three emperors that take that. There's a power struggle basically in a period of a year. There are three emperors that assume power and then are assassinated, etc. And the person who eventually takes charge is Emperor Vespasian, and he was famous for being a Roman general. He is the Roman who invaded Great Britain, and then he's also the emperor or the general who starts to put down the Jewish rebellion in the late 60s, 80, 70 or so. And then his son Titus is the next emperor. And Titus is famous for being the emperor or the general at that time who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. The next up emperor is Domitian from 81 to 96 AD. Domitian had severe persecution of Christians because they wouldn't worship him or the Roman gods, and he's the one who had the Apostle John exiled to Patmos. And then the last one of the first century is Emperor Nerva. He was the first of several emperors who stopped persecution of Christianity, although there are some later on who pick it up again. Then I want to talk a little bit about the importance of Judaism to Christianity. First of all, of course, Jesus was a Jew. All of his disciples were Jews. The first and earliest of all Christians were Jews. So these people saw Jesus and Christianity as the fulfillment of Judaism, not a rejection of it. So they did not think of themselves as starting a new religion. They thought of themselves as continuing on in Judaism, but a true form of it. During this time, both before and after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, there are Jews living in every city of the Roman Empire. Like some of we mentioned before, Apollos and Priscilla and Aquila were in places like Corinth and Alexandria and Rome, etc. So at this time, a lot of Jews don't speak Hebrew, especially those outside of Israel. And even those in Israel, a lot of them spoke Aramaic. And this is recorded an example of this is recorded in Acts after Pentecost when there are Jews from all throughout the Roman Empire visiting Jerusalem, and they are amazed when they hear the apostles speaking in their own languages. And this because, after living several generations in different locations, they would have picked up the languages where they lived. And the Old Testament was translated to Greek about the year 200 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. This is called the Septuagint or the LXX. It was called the LXX because tradition says there were 70 scribes or 70 people who worked on translating that into Greek. And the Septuagint is the Bible that's used by early Christians before they have the complete New Testament canon. And the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Bible, the Old Testament, is the text version most often quoted by the New Testament authors. Then I want to talk a little bit about the decline of the Jewish church. First of all, James, the brother of Jesus, or the cousin of Jesus if you prefer, was a leader of the church in Jerusalem, and he is killed about the year 62 AD. After that, Jewish Christians are led by a man named Simeon, who was a cousin of Jesus. It's believed that, Jesus, you got Mary and Joseph, his parents, and Joseph had a brother. Simeon would have been a son of Joseph's brother, and he begins leading the Jewish Christians after the death of James. We have the Jewish revolt against Rome that happens between 66 and 74 AD, and the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed in the year 70 AD. The Jewish revolt results in the death, expulsion, and slavery of most Jews in Israel. I'm sure Christian Jews who lived in Israel at that time were affected by this too, because at this early point in history, the Romans don't make a big distinction between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews. And during this time, Simeon and many of the Jewish Christians flee to Pella, which is in modern day Jordan, and you can see in that map on the right, close to where Pella was located. This was an isolated location, and once the Jewish believers moved there, they are no longer interacting or having an impact with Gentiles. And the community there is influenced by some strange sects over time and eventually dies out. And that's some of that is recorded by church historian Eusebius. And then Pella is entirely deserted after Muslim conquest takes place there, and there's a large earthquake in 749 AD. And so you can see a picture there on the left of the ruins of Pella. This is also quite close to where it's believed that John the Baptist was baptizing people. And we'll talk a little bit about the persecution of the church. First of all, we have a quote from church father Tertullian, which is, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." So as we're talking about this persecution, it's sad. There are a lot of cases of pain and suffering that these Christians go through, but it results in the growth of the church. And we see this throughout church history. When the church is persecuted, it grows. We see this today in places like China and Iran. So initially, Romans don't view Christianity as a threat. They see it as a Jewish sect. So the earliest persecution of Christians come from the non-believing Jews. And we see an example of that in Acts chapter 25. Paul's before Festus, and he appeals to Caesar, that would be Nero, because he doesn't want to face trial in Jerusalem. He knows he won't get a fair trial in Jerusalem. And so the first and earliest persecution of Christianity comes from Jewish non-believers. But after the Jewish revolt, Judaism is never again in a place where it is able to persecute Christianity. And unfortunately, bad Jewish Christian relations that happened early on there lead to terrible consequences down the road. And history has Christianity has a poor history of respecting the Jewish people, God's chosen people. So that is unfortunate, but that's the way history has been. Then eventually, persecution begins by Rome. So there are lots of Gentiles converting across the Roman Empire, and they start distancing themselves from Judaism, especially after the Jewish revolt. And Rome eventually begins to see Christianity as a distinct movement from Judaism and as a threat. So Nero begins severe persecution of Roman Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. It's recorded that Nero was cruel and he had Christians killed for his amusement and whims. For example, he would invite friends over to his palace, have Christians brought to his gardens at dusk, and then lit on fire. He would dress up like a charioteer riding around in his gardens and make things a bit of a circus. And his cruelty went so far that even he aroused the mercy of the Romans on behalf of the Christians. So even the Romans who did not believe in Christianity and weren't friendly to it started to feel bad for the Christians based on how severe Nero's persecution of the Christians was. And here's a quote from Tacitus, who was a non-Christian Roman historian. He lived during the time of Nero, and I think this quote is interesting because it shows that although Tacitus doesn't like the Christians, he doesn't fault them or blame them for the fire in Rome. So Tacitus says, in spite of every human effort, of the emperor's largesse, and of the sacrifices made to the gods, nothing sufficed to allay suspicion nor to destroy the opinion that the fire had been ordered. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians, who are hated for their abominations, and punished them with refined cruelty. Christ, from whom they take their name, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Stopped for a moment, this evil superstition reappeared, not only in Judea, where was the root of the evil, but also in Rome, where all things sordid and abominable from every corner of the world come together. Thus, first, those who confessed, Christians, were arrested, and on the basis of their testimony, a great number were condemned, although not so much for the fire itself as for their hatred of humankind. So, some interesting facts you see in this quote from Tacitus. Obviously, he's not a friend of Christianity, he sees Christianity as a threat, but he knows that they are not to blame for the fire, and he sees the cruel side of Nero. And he also gives us some historical facts which confirm the New Testament account that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate. And so, anyway, that's an interesting quote. Then, after Nero, things are better for Christians for a few years until the reign of the Emperor Domitian, and he resumes persecution. Domitian was a vindictive man, and he had his brother Titus, who was the previous Roman emperor. It's believed he had Titus put to death, other family members, and about 20 senators he had killed. So Domitian demands worship of himself and the Roman gods, which Christians refuse to do. And Christians at this time are blamed for disasters that happen in the empire. For example, the Mount Vesuvius eruption, which destroys Pompeii, happens about the year 79 AD. And he has John exiled to Patmos during this time. And then Domitian, like so many other Roman emperors, is eventually assassinated by his opponents. And then the last slide for this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the correspondence between Pliny and Trajan. So Pliny was a governor of Bithynia, which in the map below is roughly that area in red in Asia Minor in modern-day Turkey. And it's recorded that no one was going to the pagan temples anymore, and they were losing money because so many people had converted to Christianity. So Pliny starts requiring Christians to pray to the Roman gods, burn incense for the emperor, and curse Christ. And if they won't do that, he has them put to death. But he's putting so many Christians to death, he feels bad about it, and he writes to Emperor Trajan about how to handle things. And so Trajan replies to Pliny and says, don't seek the Christians out, don't go looking for them. And if they are anonymously accused, those accusations should be discarded. But if they are accused of something and don't recant, they must be punished. And so Christians during this time are prosecuted for contempt of Roman court if they ever go to court. So you know how, at least in the United States today, if you go to court, you say, I promise to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. They had something similar during Roman times, except you are instead pledging your honor to Caesar, and you're basically saying Caesar is your Lord. And so Christians would refuse to do this. So if they were taken to court for any matter, they would be found in contempt of Roman court and often put to death. And this reminds me, even the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are with them on the way. And this would have been very meaningful to Christians during this time period, because if they go to court, even if they're in the right, they're going to be found in contempt of the Roman court for not pledging Caesar as their Lord. And so this becomes official Roman policy for about 100 years, which doesn't mean that there was constant persecution going on in all places of the Roman Empire for those 100 years, but on and off during that period, it is an issue for Christians. So that is the end of this part one presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it. If I welcome comments in discussion in the comment section. Be nice. There's certainly things I could have gotten wrong or incorrect here, and if you think I got something wrong, feel free to point it out. As I mentioned, this is part one of 8, and so there'll be more parts coming down the road. Thanks for listening.